Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The information presented in this video is strictly for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute professional financial, legal, tax, or investment advice. Divorce proceedings and the division of retirement assets, specifically 401k accounts, involve highly complex federal and state laws, including the Employee Retirement Income Security Act and the nuanced application of qualified domestic relations orders. The historical trends, demographic data, and case studies discussed in this presentation are intended solely for illustrative purposes to help you understand broad macroeconomic and demographic shifts in the United States over the past several decades. These examples should never be interpreted as a guarantee of any specific legal or financial outcome in your own personal situation. Viewers are strongly encouraged to conduct their own thorough due diligence and consult with licensed family law attorneys, certified financial planners, and specialized tax professionals who can comprehensively evaluate their unique, individual circumstances before making any monumental financial or legal decisions. Imagine working tirelessly for 30 consecutive years, diligently contributing a percentage of every single paycheck to your company-sponsored 401k plan, systematically navigating the turbulent waters of the dot-com bubble bursting, the devastating 2008 global financial crisis, and the unprecedented economic volatility of the global pandemic. You have sacrificed present consumption for future security, watching the magic of compound interest slowly build a multi-million-dollar nest egg that represents the entirety of your American dream for a comfortable, secure retirement. Now imagine watching exactly 50% of that lifetime of financial discipline vanish in a matter of months, not because of a stock market crash or a catastrophic corporate bankruptcy, but through the stroke of a judge's pen in a family law courtroom. The single largest wealth transfer happening in the United States today is not occurring through traditional inheritance from the silent generation to the baby boomers, nor is it happening through the explosive growth of the technology sector. It is happening silently, continuously, and systematically through the dissolution of marriages, specifically targeting the retirement accounts of middle and upper-class American workers. We are currently witnessing a massive, unprecedented demographic anomaly that traditional financial advisors rarely warn you about when you are setting up your initial portfolio allocations in your 20s. The geometric, undeniable rise of the late-in-life marital dissolution, and the subsequent highly complex weaponization of the employer-sponsored 401k. To truly understand the magnitude of this situation, we must analyze the stark historical trends that created this specific environment. For the vast majority of American history, the primary, and often only significant asset divided in a divorce was the marital home. However, an invisible structural shift occurred in the late 1970s that fundamentally rewired the financial DNA of the American family. With the quiet passage of the Revenue Act of 1978, which officially birthed the 401k, the United States began a massive transition away from defined benefit plans, traditionally known as pensions, and aggressively moved toward defined contribution plans. This shifted the entire burden, risk, and responsibility of retirement savings from the corporate employer directly onto the shoulders of the individual employee. Over the next 4 decades, as pensions essentially evaporated from the private sector, the 401k swelled to become the primary repository of household wealth, eventually surpassing the equity held in residential real estate for millions of dual-income families. But this massive pool of tax-advantaged liquidity created an unintended, high-stakes consequence in the realm of family law. It created a liquid, easily identifiable target. Simultaneously, a massive demographic shift was fundamentally altering the fabric of American society. The baby boomer generation, a cohort historically known for driving massive cultural and economic changes at every stage of their life cycle, began fundamentally rewriting the demographic data of marital dissolution. We saw the advent of what sociologists and economists refer to as the gray divorce phenomenon. Historically, the statistical probability of divorce was highest in the first 7 to 10 years of marriage, a time when couples generally possessed very few accumulated assets. But historical trends over the last 2 decades reveal a doubling of the divorce rate among Americans aged 50 and older. This specific demographic intersection, the exact generation that pioneered the mass accumulation of wealth within 401k accounts suddenly divorcing at unprecedented rates right on the precipice of retirement, has turned the American family court system into the epicenter of a multi-billion-dollar financial restructuring industry. But there is a specific, underlying demographic trigger mathematically embedded in this transition that most people are completely blind to. It is a historical loophole created by the intersection of shifting marriage ages, the changing labor force participation rate of women, and the rigid federal tax codes governing retirement distributions. There is one specific, massive cohort of Americans currently, unknowingly, walking directly into a financial trap that was inadvertently set by legislative actions over 40 years ago. We are going to unpack exactly who that demographic cohort is, why the historical data points directly to their unique vulnerability, and uncover the hidden mechanics of asset division that most individuals simply do not discover until it is entirely too late to protect their financial trajectory. Throughout this deep dive, we are going to meticulously map out the entire history of 401k asset division across different demographic groups in the United States, providing you with the exact historical context you need to understand this incredibly complex landscape. We will explore how dual-income millennial divorces look fundamentally and mathematically different from the single-earner divorces of the past. We will analyze the specific historical impact of the Retirement Equity Act of 1984, which officially classified retirement accounts as joint marital property, and how that legislation sought to address historical gender disparities in wealth accumulation. By studying these demographic case studies and historical trends, you will gain a profound, expert-level understanding of the American financial and legal machine. You will see exactly how shifting societal norms, differing generational wealth accumulation strategies, and evolving legal standards have transformed the 401k from a straightforward, predictable savings vehicle into the most heavily contested and mathematically complex asset in the history of United States family law. You will understand the intricate mechanics of the Qualified Domestic Relations Order, the specialized legal instrument required to split these accounts without triggering catastrophic tax penalties, and how varying demographic factors influence its execution. Our ultimate goal is to equip you with a deep, historical, and analytical perspective, fundamentally changing the way you view wealth accumulation, the structure of modern marriage, and the long-term protection of the assets you have spent your entire adult life building. To truly grasp the gravity of this shift, we have to examine the architectural foundation of the modern American financial timeline and how it collides violently with the reality of the year 2026. Imagine a highly common scenario unfolding right now in courtrooms across the country. Meet Michael and Elizabeth, a typical upper-middle-class couple living in a suburban United States neighborhood in 2026. They have been married for 28 years. Michael entered the corporate workforce in the late 1990s, riding the wave of the tech boom, the subsequent crashes, and the long bull markets. He diligently maxed out his 401k contributions, capturing the full employer match every single year. Elizabeth also worked, but took a 7-year hiatus from her career to raise their 3 children before re-entering the workforce as a senior project manager. Because of this structural gap in her earning years and the subsequent delay in compounding interest, Elizabeth has approximately $300,000 in her individual retirement account, while Michael's 401k has swollen to an impressive $1.8 million. Combined, they hold over $2 million in pure retirement liquidity. Now, imagine that the emotional fabric of their marriage phrase, as is statistically common in the demographic phenomenon sociologists refer to as the gray divorce. They decide to amicably dissolve the marriage. On the surface, Michael and Elizabeth believe this is a straightforward mathematical equation. They assume they will simply tally up the total marital assets, divide by 2, and walk away to begin their separate lives. But the moment they present this assumption to their respective legal counsels, the illusion of simplicity shatters, revealing a labyrinth of historical tax codes and forensic accounting nightmares. To understand why Michael and Elizabeth are about to face a grueling financial battle, we must contrast their 2026 reality with a divorce that would have occurred in 1985. If this exact couple had divorced 40 years ago, Michael likely would not have had a massive liquid 401k. He would have had a defined benefit pension. A pension is essentially an invisible promise from an employer to pay a fixed monthly stipend upon retirement. In a historical divorce proceeding, the court would simply issue an order stating that when Michael eventually retired, Elizabeth would receive a specific percentage of that future monthly check. There was no immediate pile of cash to fight over, no daily fluctuating market value to calculate, and no complex tax implications to untangle in the present moment. The asset was illiquid and inaccessible. The advent of the 401k completely destroyed that paradigm. By transitioning retirement savings from invisible future promises into highly visible, liquid, present-day capital, it created a massive psychological shift in divorce negotiations. Michael's $1.8 million is not a future promise. It is sitting on a screen, updating in real time every single day the stock market is open. But here is the catastrophic historical complication that ruins the clean division of these assets. When Michael and Elizabeth married 28 years ago, Michael had already been working for 3 years. He had already contributed $35,000 to his 401k before he ever met Elizabeth. Under the laws of almost every jurisdiction in the United States, that initial $35,000 is legally classified as Michael's separate, premarital property, entirely exempt from the divorce division. If this were a simple bank account, subtracting $35,000 would take exactly 3 seconds. But inside a 401k, that initial premarital deposit has been subjected to nearly 3 decades of complex market mechanics. It has been invested in mutual funds, it has generated quarterly dividends that were automatically reinvested, it has survived stock splits, and it has compounded upon itself through multiple bull and bear markets. Furthermore, Michael's company likely changed 401k plan administrators 3 or 4 times over his career, migrating the data from one institutional platform to another, often losing granular historical tracking in the process. To legally extract Michael's separate property from the marital pool in 2026, his attorneys cannot simply guess the current value of that original $35,000. They must hire specialized forensic accountants. These financial detectives have to subpoena decades of historical plan documents, reverse engineer 28 years of specific mutual fund performance, trace every single reinvested dividend, and run complex algorithmic models to isolate exactly how much of that $1.8 million grew from the premarital baseline versus how much grew from the marital contributions. This process can take months and cost tens of thousands of dollars in billable hours, slowly draining the very wealth they are trying to protect. This scenario perfectly illustrates the demographic trap currently swallowing the baby boomer and older Generation X cohorts. These individuals are the absolute pioneers of the 401k system. They are the first generations in United States history to reach retirement age, relying almost entirely on defined contribution plans, rather than pensions. Simultaneously, they are divorcing at a rate that is statistically double what it was just 25 years ago. The intersection of these two historical trends means that the American family court system is currently clogged with hundreds of thousands of cases, exactly like Michael and Elizabeth's. Decades of wealth accumulation are being subjected to intense, expensive legal scrutiny simply because the legal frameworks designed in the 20th century are struggling to process the complex financial realities of modern retirement accounts. And the tragedy is that the forensic accounting nightmare is only the preliminary battle. Even if Michael and Elizabeth spend the requisite thousands of dollars to accurately map out the exact mathematical division of the marital property, they are still standing directly on the trapdoor of the Internal Revenue Service. Once the court agrees that Elizabeth is entitled to exactly $800,000 of Michael's 401k, a terrifying new mechanism must be triggered to move that money from his account to hers. If Michael attempts to simply withdraw that money to hand it over to Elizabeth, he will instantly trigger a devastating cascade of federal and state tax liabilities that could obliterate nearly 40% of the asset's value overnight, turning their carefully calculated settlement into a catastrophic wealth destruction event. There is only one highly specific, incredibly unforgiving legal instrument designed to prevent this tax annihilation, and a single typographical error in its drafting can render it entirely useless. The instrument is called a Qualified Domestic Relations Order, universally referred to by family law attorneys and forensic accountants as a QDRO. To understand why this specific document possesses such terrifying authority over modern wealth, we have to look back at the precise historical moment it was forged. Before 1984, the federal laws governing retirement accounts, specifically the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, contained a strict anti-alienation provision. This essentially meant that a retirement account could not be assigned, given, or transferred to anyone other than the employee who earned it. This created a massive systemic demographic crisis. In the late 70s and early 80s, the dominant demographic household structure in the United States was still largely the single-earner family. When these couples divorced, the working spouse, historically the husband, walked away with the entirety of the retirement assets protected by federal law, while the non-working spouse was frequently left financially destitute, completely locked out of the wealth they had indirectly helped build. Congress recognized this catastrophic demographic flaw and passed the Retirement Equity Act of 1984, effectively inventing the QDRO as a federal override switch. The QDRO is the only legal key capable of unlocking a 401k and transferring its contents to an alternate payee without triggering an immediate, devastating tax event. But here is the critical reality that catches thousands of Americans off guard in the year 2026. A standard divorce decree, even one signed by a state family court judge, is completely powerless against a 401k. State courts do not govern federal retirement plans. To move that money, you need a separate, specialized QDRO that meticulously translates the state judge's ruling into highly specific federal terminology that the corporate plan administrator can legally execute. Imagine a scenario unfolding right now in 2026. Meet David and Sarah. They have just finalized a bitter 2-year divorce. The state court judge has signed a final decree ordering David to transfer exactly $600,000 from his $1.2 million corporate 401k to Sarah. Exhausted from the legal battle, David decides to simply log into his online brokerage portal, execute a withdrawal of $600,000, and wire it to Sarah's bank account to comply with the judge's order. This single, unguided action instantly triggers a financial apocalypse. Because David bypassed the QDRO process, the Internal Revenue Service views this entirely as an early, unqualified distribution. First, the 401k administrator is legally required to withhold a mandatory 20% for federal income taxes right off the top, instantly vaporizing $120,000. Next, because David is under the age of 59 and a half, he is slapped with a 10% early withdrawal penalty, destroying another $60,000. Finally, the entire $600,000 distribution is added to David's ordinary income for the tax year 2026, violently pushing him into the absolute highest federal and state tax brackets. By attempting to comply with a state order without the proper federal instrument, David has effectively destroyed nearly half of the marital assets' value and bankrupted himself with tax liabilities, all while Sarah has not received the full amount she was legally awarded. To avoid this, David and Sarah must utilize a QDRO. But this is where the typographical terror begins. The QDRO is not a standardized government form you can simply download and fill out. It is a highly customized legal order that must be drafted by a specialized attorney, signed by both parties, signed by the state judge, and then submitted to the 401k plan administrator for final approval. The plan administrator acts as an absolute federal gatekeeper, operating under strict fiduciary duties. They are legally forbidden from approving any QDRO that is ambiguous or mathematically impossible. If the QDRO drafts the name of the retirement plan as the corporate employee 401k, but the official legal name in the master trust document is the corporate employee benefit savings trust, the administrator will reject it entirely. If the QDRO fails to explicitly address what happens to market gains or losses between the date of the divorce and the date the money is actually moved, it will be rejected. This administrative review process takes months, and while the paperwork bounces back and forth between attorneys and corporate compliance departments, the 401k remains invested in the live stock market. If Sarah is awarded exactly 50% of David's account as of their January 1st separation date, but the QDRO is not approved and executed until October, what happens if the market crashes 20% in the interim? Does Sarah still get her fixed dollar amount, forcing David to absorb the entirety of the market loss? Or does she get 50% of the newly depreciated value? If the QDRO lacks the specific algorithmic language to dictate the allocation of those interim market fluctuations, the corporate administrator will refuse to process the division, forcing the couple back into court to spend thousands more on legal fees just to clarify the math. We are now witnessing a profound evolution in how these instruments are deployed, driven entirely by shifting demographic realities. In the 1980s, the QDRO was almost exclusively a tool used to transfer wealth from a primary earner to a dependent spouse. But as we analyze the marital dissolutions of older millennials and Generation X in 2026, we are seeing the aggressive rise of the dual QDRO divorce. We are dealing with demographics where both spouses have spent 20 years accumulating massive, highly complex 401k portfolios. Instead of a simple one-way wealth transfer, forensic accountants must execute an intricate financial chess match, utilizing offset strategies. If both spouses have 401ks, they might calculate the present value of both, offset the differences, and only draft a single QDRO for the remaining balance to minimize exposure to administrative errors. But this strategy requires perfectly symmetrical asset valuation, which is almost impossible to achieve when you consider the underlying investments inside the accounts. And this introduces one of the most dangerous, hidden landmines in the history of American retirement planning. While most people assume their 401k is simply a basket of diversified mutual funds, millions of corporate employees hold heavily appreciated company stock inside their employer-sponsored plans. This creates a terrifying scenario involving a little-known tax provision that can completely alter the mathematical reality of a divorce settlement. If you blindly divide a 401k containing corporate stock without understanding the specific federal tax code, you could be accidentally transferring the most toxic tax burden imaginable directly onto your former spouse, or worse, keeping it for yourself without realizing it until the day you retire. This hidden tax provision is known in elite financial circles and specialized tax planning as net unrealized appreciation, or NUA. To comprehend the massive financial danger it poses during a marital dissolution, we must examine how the Internal Revenue Service treats different types of assets held inside an employer-sponsored retirement plan. Normally, every single dollar that comes out of a traditional 401k is taxed as ordinary income. It does not matter if that dollar grew from a dividend, a bond yield, or the capital appreciation of a mutual fund. The moment it crosses the threshold from the 401k into your personal bank account during retirement, it is taxed at your highest marginal income tax rate. However, the federal tax code contains a highly specific exception exclusively for company stock purchased and held inside that 401k. Under the NUA provision, if you distribute that company stock in kind, meaning you transfer the actual shares rather than liquidating them for cash, you only pay ordinary income tax on the original cost basis of those shares. The entire growth, the unrealized appreciation, is completely reclassified and taxed at the substantially lower long-term capital gains rate. Imagine a high-stakes scenario unfolding in a family court in the year 2026. Meet Thomas and Rebecca, an affluent couple going through a contentious divorce in a major tech hub. Thomas has spent the last 22 years as a senior engineer at a publicly traded multinational technology corporation. His 401k is massive, currently valued at precisely $3 million. But this portfolio is not a standard mix of diversified index funds. Because of aggressive corporate matching programs and employee stock purchase options popular in the early 2000s, his 401k consists of $1.5 million in standard target date mutual funds and $1.5 million in pure company stock. Here is the critical data point. The original cost basis for that company stock, the actual amount Thomas paid for those shares over 2 decades, is only $300,000. The remaining $1.2 million is pure, unadulterated growth. The state court judge orders a standard 50-50 split of the marital assets. Thomas and Rebecca are legally mandated to divide the $3,401,000 equally, meaning they each are entitled to $1.5 million. Rebecca's legal team, wanting to minimize administrative friction and protect her from the volatility of single company stock, proposes a seemingly logical settlement. Rebecca will take the $1.5 million in diversified mutual funds via qualified domestic relations order, and Thomas will simply keep the $1.5 million in company stock. On paper, in the eyes of the family court judge, this is a perfectly symmetrical, equitable division of assets. Both parties walk away with exactly $1.5 million of gross marital value. But beneath the surface, a catastrophic wealth transfer has just occurred due to a complete misunderstanding of tax demographics. Let us project forward to when both Thomas and Rebecca reach retirement age and begin liquidating these assets. When Rebecca withdraws her $1.5 million over her retirement, every single penny will be subject to ordinary income tax. If she sits in a combined federal and state tax bracket of roughly 30%, she will surrender $450,000 to the government, leaving her with a true after-tax purchasing power of slightly over $1 million. Now look at Thomas. Because he retained the highly appreciated company stock inside the 401k, he executes a net unrealized appreciation strategy upon retirement. He transfers the stock out of the 401k into a taxable brokerage account. He pays his 30% ordinary income tax solely on the $300,000 cost basis, costing him $90,000. The remaining $1.2 million in growth is permanently locked into the long-term capital gains tax rate, which historically hovers around 15 to 20%. If we assume a 20% capital gains rate, he pays $240,000 on the growth. Thomas's total tax liability is $330,000. By strategically utilizing the NUA loophole that Rebecca's attorneys completely overlooked, Thomas walks away with nearly $120,000 more in real, spendable wealth than his former spouse, despite the judge ordering an equal 50-50 split. This is not an isolated incident. This is a systemic, demographic reality for thousands of divorcing couples concentrated in major corporate hubs across the United States, from the pharmaceutical corridors of the East Coast to the energy sectors of Texas. This invisible tax asymmetry is further compounded by the agonizing mechanical delays inherent in the modern legal system. We are currently witnessing historical trends where the sheer volume of gray divorces is causing massive administrative bottlenecks at major financial institutions. It is not uncommon in 2026 for a complex QDRO to take anywhere from 6 to 9 months to be fully drafted, approved by opposing counsel, signed by a judge, and ultimately executed by the corporate plan administrator. During this prolonged state of legal purgatory, the 401k remains fully invested in the live, fluctuating stock market. This introduces the terrifying concept of market risk allocation during asset division. Imagine a state court judge signs a decree on February 1st, explicitly awarding a wife exactly $500,000 from her husband's $1,401,000. It is a flat dollar award, but the corporate administrator does not process the final QDRO until October 15th. Over those intervening 8 months, the global markets experience a severe correction. The husband's 401k drops by 20%, plummeting from $1 million down to $800,000. Because the original court order dictated a flat, specific dollar amount rather than a percentage, the corporate administrator is legally bound to transfer exactly $500,000 to the wife. The husband is forced to absorb the entirety of the $200,000 market loss himself, leaving him with a decimated remaining balance of only $300,000. He has essentially been forced to act as a catastrophic insurance policy for his ex-wife's settlement against global market volatility. If the attorneys had simply drafted the QDRO to specify an award of 50% of the account value as of the date of segregation, both parties would have shared the market loss equally, and the husband would have retained $400,000. These granular, seemingly minor differences in legal phrasing dictate the ultimate financial survival of the divorcing parties. And this complexity only intensifies when we shift our demographic lens away from the traditional corporate employee. For decades, the 401k divorce narrative has been dominated by the W-2 wage earner. But a massive disruptive shift in the American labor force is forcing family courts to confront a completely new financial beast. We are now entering the era of the gig economy divorce, where the predictable structure of corporate benefits collides with the erratic, hyper-customized world of the self-employed entrepreneur. When a traditional 401k is thrown into a courtroom alongside a completely unregulated solo 401k funded by an independent contractor, the mathematical baseline fundamentally breaks down, forcing forensic accountants to hunt for hidden assets in entirely new ways. To understand this new frontier of wealth division, we must first analyze the sweeping demographic changes in the American workforce leading up to the year 2026. For generations, the quintessential American retirement strategy relied on the massive, centralized infrastructure of a corporate human resources department. A neutral third-party entity managed the compliance, tracked the contributions, and provided the certified statements required by family courts. But over the last 15 years, a massive swath of older millennials and Generation X workers abandoned the traditional W-2 corporate structure, opting instead to become independent consultants, freelance specialists, and e-commerce entrepreneurs. This massive migration gave birth to the explosive popularity of the one-participant 401k, universally known as the solo 401k. Designed exclusively for business owners with no full-time employees, this hypercharged retirement vehicle allows the individual to act as both the employee making elective deferrals and the employer making massive profit-sharing contributions. It is a brilliant wealth accumulation tool, but in the context of a marital dissolution, it is a forensic accounting nightmare that completely shatters the traditional mechanics of asset division. Imagine a high-stakes scenario in 2026 involving Marcus and Chloe. Marcus is a highly successful independent software developer operating as a single-member limited liability company. Over the past 12 years of their marriage, he has aggressively funded a solo 401k, amassing a portfolio currently valued at $2.2 million. Because Marcus is technically his own employer, he is also the designated plan administrator and the named trustee of the retirement trust. When Chloe files for divorce, her legal team does not send a subpoena to a massive corporate compliance department in New York to verify the account balance. They have to demand the records directly from Marcus. Immediately, the neutral third-party verification system that family courts rely upon is completely eliminated. Marcus is effectively guarding his own vault, and the entire burden of forensic discovery falls squarely onto Chloe's legal team. Unlike a traditional corporate 401k that strictly limits investments to a heavily vetted menu of mutual funds and target date portfolios, the modern solo 401k possesses a uniquely dangerous feature that has become incredibly popular among entrepreneurial demographics: checkbook control. Through a legally complex but completely permissible structure known as a self-directed solo 401k, Marcus has the authority to write checks directly from his retirement trust to purchase alternative, non-traditional assets. He is not just buying index funds. Historical trends over the last decade show a massive surge of independent contractors using their retirement funds to purchase residential rental properties, invest in private equity syndications, and acquire raw land. Let us look at the mathematical catastrophe this creates for the family court system. During the discovery phase of the divorce, Chloe's forensic accountants discover that Marcus's $2.2 million solo 401k does not consist of liquid stocks and bonds. Instead, it holds $300,000 in cash, a multifamily rental property in a completely different state valued at $1.2 million, and a $700,000 minority stake in a private, highly illiquid tech startup. The state court judge signs a decree stating Chloe is entitled to exactly 50% of the total marital asset, meaning she is owed $1.1 million from the retirement account. If this were a traditional corporate 401k, a standard qualified domestic relations order would simply instruct the plan administrator to liquidate $1.1 million worth of mutual funds and transfer the cash to Chloe's individual retirement account. But you cannot simply liquidate half of a physical apartment building with a few clicks on a brokerage portal, nor can you easily sell off a minority stake in a private startup that has not yet gone public. This scenario forces the divorcing couple into a devastatingly expensive valuation war. Because the underlying assets are illiquid, their actual value is highly subjective. Marcus will naturally hire a real estate appraiser who will argue the multifamily property is depreciating, lowering the overall value of the 401k to minimize the amount he owes Chloe. Chloe's legal team will counter by hiring their own aggressively optimistic appraisers, arguing the property is worth significantly more. They will spend tens of thousands of dollars in billable legal hours and specialized appraisal fees fighting over the hypothetical value of an asset trapped inside a federally protected tax shelter. Furthermore, even if the judge eventually forces a definitive valuation, the mechanics of executing the division are perilous. Because the solo 401k only holds $300,000 in liquid cash, Marcus literally does not have enough liquidity inside the account to satisfy the $1.1 million judgment. He faces two potentially disastrous historical outcomes. The first outcome forces Marcus to liquidate the rental property entirely. But selling physical real estate held inside a retirement account requires navigating a minefield of federal regulations. If Marcus accidentally uses personal funds to pay for the closing costs or repairs required to sell the property, he commits a prohibited transaction. According to strict Internal Revenue Service guidelines, a single prohibited transaction instantly disqualifies the entire solo 401k, causing the entire $2.2 million balance to be treated as a fully taxable distribution on the first day of the year the error occurred. This would instantly trigger a massive tax bill that could bankrupt both Marcus and Chloe before the divorce is even finalized. The second potential outcome is an in-kind transfer, where Marcus uses a highly specialized QDRO to transfer a percentage of the actual property deed, and the startup shares directly into a self-directed individual retirement account set up by Chloe. This completely binds the divorcing couple together financially for decades. They are now unwilling co-owners of a physical rental property and private equity, requiring them to constantly communicate, share maintenance expenses, and agree on future liquidation strategies, completely defeating the entire purpose of dissolving the marriage in the first place. This specific demographic intersection of entrepreneurial wealth accumulation and alternative asset investments has transformed family courtrooms from simple venues of legal separation into highly volatile, forced business partnerships. This environment is incredibly dangerous, but it operates under the assumption that the assets, however complex or illiquid, are at least known and identifiable. The gig economy solo 401k is ultimately still tethered to an American tax return. But what happens when we escalate our analysis to the very peak of the demographic wealth pyramid? What happens when we leave the realm of the independent contractor and enter the opaque, legally fortified world of the ultra-high net worth individual? As we peel back the layers of historical asset protection, we discover a completely different class of financial architecture, one where retirement accounts are systematically woven together with irrevocable trusts and multi-generational wealth preservation strategies, creating an invisible, legally impenetrable labyrinth that completely paralyzes the traditional family court system and forces opposing attorneys to fight a ghost. To truly understand how the demographics of the top 1% navigate the dissolution of a retirement empire, we must examine the historical evolution of executive compensation in the United States. While the average American worker is tethered to a standard 401k with strict annual contribution limits, the ultra-high net worth demographic utilizes a shadow retirement system known as non-qualified deferred compensation plans, or NQDC. These plans are not governed by the same Employee Retirement Income Security Act rules that protect standard 401ks. Instead, they are essentially unsecured promises from a corporation to pay an executive at a future date. In the year 2026, as we witness the divorce of high-level corporate leaders, these shadow accounts present a demographic anomaly that creates a total breakdown in traditional asset division logic. Imagine a high-stakes scenario involving Christopher, a chief operating officer for a Fortune 500 company, and his spouse, Julianne. Christopher has a standard 401k valued at the federal maximum, but that is merely the tip of the iceberg. Hidden beneath the surface is a non-qualified deferred compensation account valued at $8 million. This account represents years of Christopher choosing to defer his massive performance bonuses and a significant portion of his salary to avoid current income taxes. Here is where the legal and demographic trapdoor opens. Because this is a non-qualified plan, it is not eligible for a qualified domestic relations order. You cannot use the standard federal key to unlock this $8 million vault. In a traditional middle-class divorce, the court would simply order a transfer of funds. But with an NQDC plan, the company is the legal owner of the assets, and Christopher is merely a general creditor of the firm. If the company goes bankrupt, Christopher and Julian lose everything. More importantly, many corporate contracts explicitly forbid the assignment of these plans to a non-employee spouse. Julianne's legal team is now faced with a demographic reality often seen in elite circles: the offset problem. To give Julianne her $4 million share of that deferred compensation, the court would typically have to award her $4 million worth of other, more liquid assets, such as the primary residence or brokerage accounts. But in 2026, we are seeing a trend where the retirement assets have become so massive that they dwarf all other marital property. There simply are not enough other assets to offset the value. This leads to the creation of the if, as, and when arrangement. The court enters an order stating that Julianne will receive her share of the money only if, as, and when Christopher actually receives it from his company, which could be 15 years in the future. This creates a psychological and financial demographic called the tethered divorcee. Julianne remains financially dependent on Christopher's continued employment and the long-term solvency of his specific corporation. If Christopher is fired for cause, or if the company collapses during a market downturn in the late 2020s, Julianne's retirement security evaporates along with his. This is the invisible ghost that elite attorneys fight, an asset that exists on a balance sheet but cannot be touched, moved, or secured for a decade or more. While the elite struggle with the complexities of shadow accounts, a completely different demographic crisis is unfolding within the American public sector. We must analyze the historical trends of the government worker and the military member. For decades, these roles were seen as the gold standard of retirement security because they relied on traditional pensions. However, the introduction of the Thrift Savings Plan, or TSP, which is the government's equivalent of a 401k, has introduced a level of demographic volatility previously unseen in civil service divorces. Imagine a scenario in 2026 involving Robert, a career federal law enforcement officer, and his spouse Maria. Robert has 24 years of service. He has a traditional FERS pension, but he also has a TSP account valued at $900,000. In the United States, the division of a TSP account is governed by a Retirement Benefits Court Order, or RBCO, which is a specialized sibling to the QDRO. Historical data indicates that federal employees often have a much higher percentage of their total net worth locked into these government-managed accounts compared to private sector workers who may have more diversified investments. The demographic danger here is the intersection of federal law and life insurance. Most people do not realize that when a TSP is divided, it can have a direct, catastrophic impact on the survivor benefit plan of the pension. If the RBCO is not drafted with extreme precision, a divorcing spouse might receive half of the TSP but unknowingly waive their right to the survivor annuity of the pension. In 2026, we are seeing an influx of case studies where retired spouses, years after their divorce is finalized, discover upon the death of their ex-partner that their income has been cut by 70% because a clerk at the Office of Personnel Management rejected a poorly phrased court order from 20 years prior. This demographic of civil servants, from teachers to postal workers to military officers, is currently the most at risk for what we call the clerical poverty trap. Unlike private corporations that might have a dedicated HR team to help explain the nuances of a 401k split, government agencies are often understaffed and provide zero guidance on how to properly draft an RBCO. One misplaced comma or a failure to specify the exact percentage versus a dollar amount can result in the federal government refusing to pay out for decades. Beyond the administrative nightmare, we have to look at the emerging demographic of the multinational divorce. In 2026, the United States labor force is more globalized than ever. Imagine an American citizen working for a United States company, but living in London or Singapore, contributing to a 401k while their spouse is a foreign national. The demographic complexity of dividing a 401k when one party lives outside the jurisdiction of the United States tax code is a legal frontier that is currently exploding. If a 401k is split and the funds are moved to a non-resident alien, the withholding requirements change fundamentally. The standard 20% withholding for a QDRO could jump to a mandatory 30% under different tax treaties, or the receiving spouse could find themselves taxed twice, once by the IRS and once by their home country's revenue service. We are seeing a trend where international couples are inadvertently creating massive tax leaks because they treat their 401k like a simple bank account that can be wired across borders. The demographic data shows that as remote work and global corporate transfers increase, the number of 401k accounts subject to international treaty law is skyrocketing. This is no longer a problem reserved for the ultra-wealthy. It is becoming a standard hurdle for the modern mobile professional. As we look at these layers, the shadow accounts of the elite, the rigid bureaucracy of the government worker, and the global entanglements of the international professional, we see a common thread. The 401k has become a demographic weapon of mass financial destruction because the laws governing it were written for a stationary, single-earner society that no longer exists in 2026. But there is one final, most devastating demographic shift that we have yet to uncover. It is a biological and economic collision that is specifically targeting the youngest generation of workers, the millennials who are now entering their peak earning years and starting to face their first major wave of divorces. This generation has a fundamentally different relationship with their 401k, involving high-interest debt, student loans, and a specific type of internal account loan that is creating a mathematical paradox in the courtroom. When you factor in the 401k loan, the division of assets doesn't just involve moving money. It involves dividing a debt that one spouse technically owes to themselves, creating a legal feedback loop that can leave both parties with nothing but a massive tax bill and a defaulted loan. To understand why the 401k loan has become the primary demographic landmine for millennials and older Gen Z workers in 2026, we have to look at the historical economic pressures that shape this generation's financial behavior. Unlike the baby boomers, who largely benefited from massive real estate appreciation and lower relative education costs, millennials entered the workforce burdened by the highest student loan debt in American history. To cope with high housing costs and the rising expense of child-rearing in a volatile economy, millions of these younger workers began utilizing a specific feature of their retirement plans that was originally intended only for emergencies: the 401k participant loan. This allows an employee to borrow up to 50% of their vested balance, up to a maximum of $50,000, and pay it back to themselves with interest. On paper, it looks like a clever way to access liquidity without a credit check. In a divorce proceeding, however, it creates a mathematical paradox that can paralyze the division of assets. Imagine a high-stakes scenario involving Jason and Amanda, a millennial couple in their late 30s living in a high-cost urban center in 2026. Jason is a senior marketing director with a 401k valued at $400,000. 2 years ago, to cover the down payment on their family home and consolidate some high-interest debt, Jason took out a $50,000 loan from his 401k. He has been diligently paying it back through automatic payroll deductions. When the couple decides to divorce, they agree to a 50-50 split of the marital assets. Amanda's legal team looks at the account statement and sees a gross value of $400,000. They demand $200,000. But Jason's attorney points out that $50,000 of that is actually an outstanding loan. The liquid cash in the account is only $350,000. Here is where the demographic collision happens. If the court orders Jason to transfer $200,000 to Amanda via a qualified domestic relations order, the plan administrator will look at the available liquid balance. If Jason cannot pay back the $50,000 loan immediately in full, the plan might not allow the transfer of the full $200,000. Even more dangerous is the historical trend of job mobility within this demographic. If Jason loses his job or decides to leave his company during the divorce, that 401k loan is typically due in full almost immediately. If he cannot pay it back, the IRS deems the outstanding balance a deemed distribution. This means Jason is hit with a 10% early withdrawal penalty and ordinary income tax on the $50,000. Suddenly, the marital asset they were fighting over has shrunk by $20,000 due to taxes and penalties, leaving both parties fighting over a smaller and increasingly toxic pile of money. This scenario is becoming an epidemic in 2026 because of the sheer volume of participant loans held by the younger demographic. When you add a divorce into the mix, the 401k loan becomes a weapon. One spouse might refuse to pay back the loan to spite the other, or the other spouse might demand a share of the account value that does not account for the debt, forcing the account holder into a liquidity crisis. Forensic accountants now have to determine if the loan was used for marital purposes, such as a home renovation, or separate purposes, such as an individual business venture. This distinction determines whether the $50,000 debt is shared by both parties, or if it is subtracted entirely from Jason's half of the retirement pot. Beyond the complexity of internal loans, we must analyze the historical rise of the Roth 401k and how it has fundamentally altered the demographic of tax-advantaged divorce. Since its introduction in the early 2000s and its explosive growth over the last decade, the Roth 401k has created a massive valuation gap in the courtroom. In a traditional 401k, the money is pre-tax, meaning the government owns a significant portion of it in the form of future taxes. In a Roth 401k, the money is post-tax, meaning the owner keeps every dollar. Imagine a case study in 2026 where a couple, Brian and Sarah, are dividing their assets. Brian has a traditional 401k with $500,000. Sarah has a Roth 401k with $500,000. On a standard balance sheet used by a family court judge, these two accounts look identical. They are both retirement accounts worth $500,000. But in reality, they are not even close to being equal. Sarah's Roth 401k is worth significantly more in terms of future purchasing power because she will never pay a dime in taxes on that money. Brian's account, once adjusted for a 25% effective tax rate, is only worth $375,000. In the year 2026, we are seeing a dramatic increase in litigation over tax-adjusted present value. Savvy attorneys are no longer accepting a simple dollar-for-dollar trade between traditional and Roth accounts. They are bringing in actuarial experts to run simulations based on future tax brackets and demographic life expectancy to prove that a 50-50 split of the face value is actually a 40-60 split of real-world wealth. This creates a demographic divide between those who can afford high-level financial experts to argue these points, and those who simply follow the judge's orders and unknowingly walk away with 30% less wealth than their spouse. This brings us to the most overlooked demographic factor in 401k history: the gender-based longevity gap. Statistically, women in the United States live significantly longer than men. When a 401k is split in a divorce at age 60, a woman receiving $250,000 has to make that money last for an average of 5 to 7 years longer than her male counterpart. Historical trends show that women are more likely to exhaust their retirement savings and fall into poverty in their 80s and 90s. In 2026, we are seeing a movement toward longevity-adjusted settlements, where attorneys argue that the marital division should reflect the demographic reality of how long that money needs to provide support. However, this is met with intense legal resistance, as it challenges the fundamental principle of equitable distribution. The court is forced to decide: is it fair to give one spouse more money simply because they are statistically likely to live longer? This question is becoming the central battleground for the aging baby boomer and Gen X demographics, who are realizing that 50% of a 401k might not be enough to survive the rising costs of healthcare and long-term care in the late 2020s. The 401k, which started as a simple corporate perk in 1978, has evolved into a complex biological, mathematical, and legal instrument. We have moved from the simple division of pension checks to forensic accounting of market volatility, tax basis wars, and the paradox of self-owed debt. But even as we master the nuances of the 401k, A new and even more volatile asset is appearing on the marital balance sheets of the United States. This asset does not exist in any bank, it is not regulated by the Department of Labor, and it can be moved across the planet in seconds with a private key. As we move into the next phase of our deep dive, we have to address the collision between the traditional 401k and the digital frontier, because the biggest threat to your retirement division in 2026 is not the IRS, it is the invisible, encrypted wealth that your spouse might be hiding in plain sight. As we enter the year 2026, the collision between traditional retirement vehicles and the digital frontier has created a demographic phenomenon that is currently overwhelming the American legal system. While the historical focus of asset division has always been on the transparent, employer-reported 401k, we are now seeing the rise of the shadow retirement. This occurs when one spouse systematically redirects marital income, or even 401k loan proceeds into decentralized digital assets. In the past, a forensic accountant could simply follow a paper trail of bank statements to find hidden cash. In the modern era, that trail often ends at a cold storage hardware wallet or an offshore digital exchange. Imagine a high-stakes scenario involving Mark and Jennifer. Mark is a high-earning consultant who, over the last 5 years, has grown increasingly concerned about the volatility of the traditional stock market. While he continued to contribute the minimum to his corporate 401k to receive the employer match, he began siphoning off a significant portion of his year-end bonuses into various digital currencies. By the time Jennifer filed for divorce in 2026, Mark's 401k appeared relatively modest on his financial disclosure forms, valued at approximately $200,000. However, hidden within the marital residence was a small, encrypted device containing over $800,000 in digital assets. This creates a demographic crisis specifically within the tech-savvy, younger cohorts of the workforce. Historical trends suggest that the spouse with the higher degree of technical literacy often holds a massive, unquantifiable advantage in divorce negotiations. Jennifer's legal team must now decide if it is worth spending $50,000 on a specialized digital forensic expert to hunt for assets that may have been tumbled through privacy-preserving protocols, making them virtually untraceable. This is the new frontier of the 401k divorce, the battle between the documented and the undocumented. If Mark is caught, he faces severe legal sanctions, but for many in this demographic, the potential outcomes of successfully hiding such a massive portion of the marital estate outweigh the perceived risks of a family court reprimand. Furthermore, we must analyze the historical evolution of the 401k loan itself as a mechanism for asset hiding. In 2026, we are seeing a trend where a spouse takes the maximum $50,000 loan from their 401k shortly before filing for divorce. They claim the money was lost in a series of poor personal investments or spent on undocumented lifestyle expenses. In reality, the cash was converted into a non-reported asset class. Because the 401k administrator only reports the outstanding loan balance and not what was done with the proceeds, the family court is often left in a state of evidentiary paralysis. This tactic is particularly prevalent in states with slow-moving court dockets, where the delay between filing and the final trial provides ample time to obscure the digital paper trail. To understand the broader demographic implications, we have to look at the historical data regarding the types of assets now being included in 401k portfolios. In recent years, the Department of Labor has issued guidance that allows for more complex, alternative investments within certain types of self-directed brokerage windows inside a 401k. This means that a retirement account in 2026 is no longer just a collection of mutual funds. It can include private credit, real estate investment trusts, and even commodity-linked derivatives. Each of these assets requires a different method of valuation and a different legal strategy for division. Imagine if a couple is forced to divide a 401k that holds a significant position in a private equity fund that has a 10-year lockup period. The court cannot order the liquidation of that asset because the fund rules forbid it. Instead, the legal team must draft a deferred distribution order. This is a historical shift away from the clean break divorce. Under this arrangement, the former spouses remain financially linked for a decade or more, waiting for a specific investment to mature before they can finally receive their respective shares. This creates a demographic of the permanently entangled, where individuals in their 40s and 50s find themselves unable to fully move on from their former partner because their largest financial asset is held hostage by a corporate investment schedule. Step by step, the process of dividing these complex portfolios is becoming a war of attrition. First, there is the discovery phase, where every single transaction within the 401k over the last decade is scrutinized for potential waste or hidden transfers. Second, there is the valuation phase, where competing experts argue over the future value of illiquid assets. Third, there is the tax impact analysis, where the parties fight over who will bear the burden of the eventual distribution taxes. And finally, there is the drafting of the Qualified Domestic Relations Order, which in 2026 must now account for these non-traditional asset classes. If the QDRO is drafted for a 401k that holds both liquid stocks and illiquid private equity, the language must be incredibly precise to dictate how the administrator should handle the different liquidity profiles of each asset. But the most significant demographic shift we are observing involves the concept of the 401k as a life insurance substitute. Historically, life insurance was a separate, dedicated product. However, as 401k balances have grown, many families have come to view the retirement account as the primary safety net for a surviving spouse. In a divorce, this creates a massive security gap. If a husband is ordered to transfer half of his 401k to his wife, but he dies before the QDRO is fully executed, the wife could lose everything. Most 401k plans operate under a default rule where the named beneficiary receives the entire balance upon the account holder's death. If the husband never updated his beneficiary designation after the divorce decree was signed, his new spouse or even a distant relative could legally claim the entire account, leaving the ex-wife with nothing but a worthless court order. In 2026, specialized attorneys are now insisting on the inclusion of a QDRO pre-approval clause in all separation agreements. This is a relatively new historical trend designed to protect against the demographic risk of death or disability during the long administrative wait times of the corporate plan administrator. It effectively grants the non-employee spouse a temporary lien against the 401k balance the moment the divorce is filed. This prevents the account holder from taking out new loans, changing beneficiaries, or moving the money into higher-risk investments while the final legal paperwork is being processed. As we examine these case studies and the evolving data, it becomes clear that the 401k is no longer a passive savings account. It is a dynamic, high-risk legal entity. The intersection of digital asset hiding, illiquid investment lockups, and the clerical dangers of beneficiary designations has turned the modern divorce into a minefield of wealth destruction. Yet, even as we struggle to manage the assets that exist today, a new demographic challenge is emerging on the horizon. It involves the rising cost of longevity and the historical failure of the 401k system to account for the catastrophic expenses of late-life cognitive decline. In the next part of our masterclass, we will uncover how the division of a 401k today is being fundamentally reshaped by the terrifying mathematical reality of the long-term care crisis, and why the 50-50 split you agreed to in court might actually be a sentence to financial insolvency in your 80s. The intersection of demographic aging and the fragmentation of the American nuclear family has created a math problem that the current family court system is fundamentally unequipped to solve. As we move through 2026, we are seeing the emergence of the longevity trap in 401k divisions. Historically, the division of marital assets was based on a snapshot of the present value. If a couple had $1 million in a 401k, the court looked at that $1 million as a static pile of utility to be halved. But in the modern era of medical advancement, we are seeing a demographic shift where the tail end of life, the period between ages 80 and 100, is becoming the most expensive phase of human existence. This is primarily due to the astronomical costs of long-term care and the specific cognitive health crises facing the aging population in the United States. Imagine a high-stakes scenario involving Linda and James. They are divorcing in 2026 after 35 years of marriage. They are both 62 years old. Their primary asset is James's 401k, valued at $1.6 million. Following the standard legal precedent, the court awards Linda $800,000 through a qualified domestic relations order. On paper, Linda feels secure. She has nearly $1 million in a tax-advantaged account. However, historical trends in healthcare costs for the year 2026 indicate that a semi-private room in a skilled nursing facility now averages over $150,000 per year in many U.S. metropolitan areas. Because women statistically outlive men by a significant margin, Linda's $800,000 must be projected over a much longer horizon. If James lives to 82 and Linda lives to 92, that 10-year gap represents $1 million difference in required capital that the court failed to account for during the asset division. When a 401k is split down the middle at age 62, The husband is essentially receiving a larger share of lifestyle-adjusted wealth because he has fewer years of projected catastrophic healthcare expenses to fund. We are now seeing a demographic of divorced women in their 80s who are the first generation to rely solely on a 401k split from the 1990s or early 2000s, and the data is showing a sharp increase in what economists call the divorce poverty cliff. They are running out of money exactly when their care needs are the highest. This brings us to a critical step-by-step forensic analysis that is becoming mandatory in elite 2026 divorce proceedings: the long-term care offset. Savvy legal teams are no longer just looking at the account balance. They are hiring geriatric care managers and actuaries to perform a future cost projection for each spouse. They analyze family medical history, current health status, and regional cost of care data. If the data shows that one spouse has a significantly higher probability of requiring expensive specialized care, attorneys are arguing for a non-equitable distribution. They might demand 60 or 70% of the 401k for the spouse with the higher longevity risk to ensure that both parties have a statistically equal chance of not ending up as a ward of the state in their final decade. But this demographic protection strategy creates a new historical conflict: the battle of the beneficiaries. In 2026, the 401k is not just a retirement fund. It has become the primary inheritance vehicle for the next generation. When a 401k is split in a late-life divorce, the adult children of the marriage often see their future inheritance halved overnight. This has led to an increase in adult children intervening in their parents' divorce proceedings, often siding with the parent who holds the larger 401k balance in an attempt to preserve the principal from being drained by a QDRO transfer to the other parent, who might have different estate planning intentions. Imagine if James, from our previous case study, decides to remarry a younger woman 2 years after his divorce from Linda. Under federal law, his new wife automatically becomes the primary beneficiary of his remaining $800,401,000, unless she signs a specific waiver. If James dies suddenly, the $400,000 that his adult children expected to inherit from his share of the marital labor vanishes into a new family unit. This demographic volatility, the rapid reshuffling of family structures in the silver divorce era, has turned the 401k into a source of intense intergenerational friction. To mitigate this, we are seeing a rise in the use of the 401k trust. In these specialized case studies, the QDRO does not transfer the money to the ex-spouse's individual retirement account. Instead, it transfers the money into a highly structured trust that provides income to the ex-spouse for life, but dictates exactly where the remaining principal goes upon their death. This is an attempt to use 20th century trust law to fix the demographic flaws of the 20th century 401k system. However, the IRS has incredibly strict rules about how trusts can own retirement assets. One mistake in the trust language regarding required minimum distributions can result in the entire account being liquidated and taxed at the highest trust tax rate, currently reaching 37% at very low income thresholds, essentially destroying the wealth they were trying to protect. Furthermore, we must address the demographic impact of the Secure Act and its subsequent 2026 iterations. Historically, if you inherited a 401k, you could stretch the tax payments over your entire lifetime. But the law has shifted, forcing most non-spouse beneficiaries to empty the account and pay all taxes within 10 years. This has a massive impact on how 401k assets are valued during a divorce. If the court awards a spouse a large 401k balance today, they are also awarding them a massive future tax liability that their heirs will be forced to settle on an accelerated timeline. In a 2026 divorce negotiation, a $1 million brokerage account and a $1,401,000 are no longer even in the same universe of value when you factor in the demographic reality of the 10-year stretch rule. As we analyze these layers of healthcare costs, remarriage risks, and inheritance tax traps, a clear picture emerges. The 401k was designed as a simple tool for a different version of America, one where people died younger, stayed married longer, and healthcare was significantly less expensive. In the year 2026, trying to divide a 401k using 50-year-old logic is like trying to perform heart surgery with a hatchet. It is a blunt instrument being used in an incredibly delicate and complex demographic environment. But even with all these protections, the forensic care projections, the longevity offsets, and the complex trusts, there is still one variable that no attorney and no judge can control. It is the variable that sits at the center of the U.S. economy and dictates whether your $800,000 settlement will actually buy a dignified retirement, or if it will be inflated away into irrelevance. As we move into the final part of our deep dive, We are going to look at the ultimate historical destroyer of the 401k divorce settlement, the collision between fixed retirement distributions and the unprecedented inflationary cycles of the late 2020s. We will uncover the one specific, hidden clause you must include in your QDRO if you want to protect your share of the 401k from being vaporized by the changing value of the US dollar before you even have a chance to spend it. This hidden clause is known as the cost of living adjustment or COLA provision, and its absence in a 2026 Qualified Domestic Relations Order is the single greatest demographic threat to post-divorce financial stability. To understand why, we have to look at the historical precedent of the mid-20th century versus the inflationary reality of today. In the 1980s and 90s, inflation was relatively stable, and the purchasing power of a dollar remained somewhat predictable over a 10-year horizon. However, as we navigate the economic landscape of 2026, we are witnessing a structural shift where the cost of essential services, healthcare, energy, and housing is decoupling from the general consumer price index. If you are awarded a flat monthly sum or a fixed dollar amount from a 401k that is scheduled to be paid out over 20 years, and that document does not include an inflation-indexed adjustment clause, you are essentially agreeing to a settlement that devalues itself every single month. Imagine a high-stakes scenario involving Karen and Stephen. In their 2026 divorce settlement, the court determines that Stephen's $2,401,000 should be divided equally. However, because the account holds specific illiquid assets that cannot be sold for another 5 years, the judge orders a deferred distribution. Karen is awarded $1 million to be transferred in 2031. On paper, Karen is a millionaire. But if the United States experiences a cumulative inflation rate of 20% over those 5 years, a historical trend seen in several volatile 5-year periods in the last century, Karen's $1 million in 2031 will only buy what $800,000 buys today. Without a clause that adjusts her awarded portion for the time value of money or market growth, she is effectively losing $200,000 of purchasing power while she waits for a clerical process to conclude. This demographic of the waiting spouse is growing rapidly. Step by step, the destruction of wealth occurs because the legal language of the QDRO often lags behind the mathematical reality of the economy. A standard, poorly drafted QDRO might say the alternate payee is entitled to $1 million. A masterclass-level QDRO, however, will state that the alternate payee is entitled to $1 million plus interest at the plan's actual rate of return, or a set percentage tied to the consumer price index, from the date of the divorce decree until the date of actual distribution. This distinction is the difference between a retirement spent in comfort and one spent in a state of constant financial erosion. Furthermore, we must examine the historical impact of the 401k's required minimum distributions on the divorce demographic. By the time many couples reach the age of 73 or 75 in 2026, the IRS mandates that they start taking money out of their accounts, whether they want to or not. In a divorce, this creates a demographic friction point regarding tax brackets. Imagine if Karen is awarded 50% of Stephen's account, but Stephen is already 75 and forced to take massive annual distributions. If the QDRO is not executed immediately, those forced distributions might be taxed at Stephen's high income tax rate, even though half the money belongs to Karen. Forensic accountants in 2026 are now seeing cases where one spouse sues the other for the tax overpayments caused by delays in the QDRO process. The demographic of elderly divorcees is finding that the IRS is often a more aggressive adversary than their former spouse. To add another layer of complexity, let us look at the historical trend of the 401k as a tool for corporate recapture. In some highly specific, older 401k plans, there are forfeiture clauses. If an employee is fired for certain types of misconduct, the employer match can sometimes be clawed back. If a spouse is awarded half of a 401k that is still subject to these vesting or forfeiture rules, they are tethered to the behavior and employment status of their ex-partner. Imagine a scenario where a wife is awarded $500,000, but before the money is moved, her ex-husband is terminated for cause, triggering a corporate recapture of the unvested match. The wife's settlement could vanish through no fault of her own. In 2026, professional scriptwriters of legal documents are now including indemnity clauses that require the employee spouse to make up for any such losses out of their separate property, ensuring the demographic risk of employment termination is not shared by the non-employee. As we conclude this deep dive masterclass, we have to look at the ultimate demographic shift: the end of the 401k era as we know it. Historical trends indicate that the United States is moving toward a more centralized, perhaps even government-mandated, retirement system to combat the massive savings gap. As the 401k becomes a relic of a previous economic era, the people currently in the middle of a 401k divorce are the final generation to deal with this specific type of private wealth division. They are the pioneers of the QDRO, the victims of the NUA tax trap, and the subjects of the longevity care crisis experiments. The data from 2026 shows that the most successful demographic in these divorces, those who walk away with their lifestyle intact, are not necessarily the ones with the most money, but the ones with the most precise legal instruments. They are the ones who understood that a 401k is not a bank account, but a federally regulated trust subject to 1,000 different variables. They understood that the division of labor in a marriage is not just about who earned the paycheck, but about who understands the tax code that governs that paycheck decades later. Every single step we have discussed, from the forensic tracing of premarital contributions to the drafting of inflation-protected QDROs, is designed to solve one specific American problem: how to maintain a dignified life when the structural unit of your survival, the marriage, dissolves. The history of the 401k divorce is the history of the American middle class trying to find its footing on shifting financial sands. By understanding these demographic trends, the historical traps, and the mathematical realities of the year 2026, you are no longer a passive participant in a legal process. You are an informed navigator of a complex financial machine. The story of wealth in the United States is changing. The days of simple pensions and clear-cut asset division are gone. We are now in the era of the forensic divorce, the digital asset hunt, and the longevity-adjusted settlement. As you move forward from this masterclass, remember that the $500,000 you see on a statement today is merely a placeholder for a complex set of future outcomes. The real work begins in the details of the transfer, the timing of the taxes, and the protection of your purchasing power against a world that is becoming more expensive by the hour. This has been the definitive guide to the demographics of 401k divorce in U.S. history, but as we look toward the future, a new question arises. What happens when the retirement system itself faces its own version of a divorce from the traditional economy? We will explore that fundamental shift in our next investigation into the future of American wealth preservation.